Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of our comic book tutorial. Today, we're going to be taking all the elements we designed in part 1 and turn it into a fully rendered animation in After Effects. If you missed part 1, why not go there now and I'll meet you back here when you're done. Let's start our project by opening After Effects and creating a new composition. For this project, we'll be using the HDTV 1080 29.97 preset, which is perfect for YouTube. For the duration, I always give myself plenty of room to start with. I know the length of the audio file we'll be using is 17 seconds, so this is more than enough. Last thing for setting up is to give our composition a meaningful name. Let's call it main because it will be the main composition we'll be working in. The first thing we're going to want to do is import our assets. We import files by double-clicking in the project panel. Let's start with the final set PSD we created in tutorial 1. Import it as a merged layer. Let's grab our audio file. And now I'll pause as I hover over this file called explosions.ai because we haven't seen this yet. Allow me to explain. Here I am in Illustrator with the 3 explosion elements that I copied from the free pick assets we used in part 1 and laid them over a simple background with everything living on a single layer. I want to use these as individual elements and ignore the background when I move it into After Effects, and to do that, I need to relocate each element to its own layer. Start by opening the Layers panel. Create 3 new layers. Rename the lowest Background, the second Explosion 1, then 2, and finally 3. Now I drag my cursor to select the first element. I select over the background again while holding Shift to remove it away from my active selection, leaving behind only the element. Now I press Ctrl X to cut, move to the XP1 layer, and press Ctrl Shift V to paste in place. I repeat this for the other 2, moving each into their own layer. By locking the background layer, I can prevent it from being selectable at all. In hindsight, I should have relocated the background to a different layer first and then locked that to make selecting the other elements easier, but what are you gonna do? And now that we've done this, we can go ahead and save it as explosions.ai or whatever you want to call it. You know, I'm not your boss. So now when you import the AI file, instead of choosing merged layers like we did with the set, you can instead choose which layer you want to import, corresponding of course with the layers that we set up in Illustrator. Layer size is fine over here. The only point I find cumbersome is the need to import each layer individually. This really seems like something I should be able to do in bulk. From the onset of your work, it's always advised to hold good organizational practices as a priority. Let's create a general folder called Assets and drop everything that isn't our main comp into it. Create a folder for the audio, one for our explosive elements. Here I import the logo. Let's create a folder for it too. And create a folder for our set just so it doesn't feel left out. Believe it or not, these are about all the assets we'll need to create this entire animation. And with our files in place, we can start setting up our scene. Let's pull the final set PSD down into our timeline. Press S as the shortcut for scale. Now drag the bar until we reach a more manageable size. Here, I use the cursor keys to move it across. Use Shift to make larger jumps. As you can see, it's useful to drag these edges to resize these panels as your needs around the work area change, giving more space to the task at hand. Now let's drag the audio down into the timeline. And here we can see the length of the track in contrast to the length of our composition. Hold down Shift and drag the time marker until it snaps to the end of our audio file. Next, grab the work area slider and drag it back to the same point. Now right-click on the slider and select Trim Comp to Work Area. And just like that, we've taken the guesswork out of choosing a duration for the comp. Now let's bring in all the explosions. Move them into temporary positions for now. Now select all of them and press S to bring up their scale sliders. The icon I tick on these vector assets is the continuous rasterize option, which is necessary to display vectors smoothly, but can also cause a bunch of problems if not treated properly. With our elements laid out, let's save our project. I like to save my project as numbers, starting at 1, with an optional prefix before it. As we continue to make significant progress throughout the video, this number will increase. Now let's grab the text tool and drag a box to input our first bit of text. I'm using this reference image I saved from part 1 of the tutorial to guide me as I lay out my text. Put your text in, adjust the size, and change the color to black. Let's create a text box for it. Go to Layer, New, and choose Solid. We have now created a solid that fills the whole frame, completely useless. To make it useful, we grab the rectangle tool and draw a mask to the approximate size and location we want our text block to be. You can use these drop-down arrows besides assets in the timeline to access their properties, including masks. Make sure the text block is below our text. You can move and resize masks by grabbing either their vertices or their sides. Use Ctrl-Shift-A to deselect everything. Now let's add a drop shadow. Go to the Effects and Presets window and search for drop shadow. Close enough. I'm mere pixels away from applying the drop shadow when my ADD kicks in and I realize that the text block is a blasphemous shade of white. And with the solid selected in the timeline, press Ctrl-Shift-Y to edit it. Crisis averted, and we return to applying the drop shadow by dragging it directly onto the layer. This should make it active in the Effects Control window. From here, you'll want to adjust the direction, distance, softness, and the opacity until it looks how you want it to. Now select the text and its respective block and press Ctrl-D to duplicate the layers. Grab the newly created layers and drag them to the top of the timeline. Rename and relocate the elements. This is a highly efficient way of creating similar elements quickly. Adjust the text first to your liking and then adjust the mask until it fits. For the thought bubble, let's create a new solid by pressing Ctrl-Y. This time, however, instead of using the rectangle tool, we'll use the ellipse tool to draw our mask. I duplicate this text chunk and move it up as a time saver. Resize it, and now we've come to our first important animation tip: anchor points. You may notice this crosshair icon. This is the object's anchor point. This is the point that is referenced by After Effects whenever an object's position is called into play. If we want to move this across the screen, when we resize it, and even when we rotate it, these all work around the location of this anchor. For the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to be adjusting all the anchor points of our object to sit roughly within their centers. We do this by pressing Y to equip the Pan Behind tool. One of the features of this tool is that it allows us to click and drag the anchor points of objects. Place the anchor neatly in the center, press V to return to the traditional selection tool, and let's continue. I duplicate the bubble a few times for resizing. As a general thought process, you'll always want to try and maximize how many times you can reuse something. Animations can be incredibly lengthy ordeals, and creating mini templates for yourself make them, however slightly, that much more manageable. I didn't feel it was standing out enough here, so I selected the drop shadow and duplicated it. With a few quick adjustments, most notably to the direction, we've added just a little more presence to the humble bubble. I decided to do this for the others as well. Now let's create our other text fields for the action shots. The spacing of the font sucks, so I have to space it out manually. And then we scale it up to a more appropriate size. Press Y and relocate the anchor point. Now I'll teach you a trick I wish I knew when I was first starting out and had to deal with 10,000 layers. See these layers here? We don't need them right now, so we're going to hide them. And to do that, we click the manliest of all Adobe buttons. It's called Shy, and apparently turns these layers shy. Anyway, what's great about shy layers is that when you click this button, it hides every layer marked as shy. I rotate the explosion to line up with the text. Now, change the color of the text to something a little more exciting. I sample some of the color from the explosion itself. Click over here and let's add a stroke. You can play with the width if you like. And now, at this point, all our text elements are essentially in place. We're finally ready to start animating. And to help us is an incredible free plugin called Animation Composer, available from MrHorse.tv. It claims 3 hours of work done in 3 minutes, and they are not lying. This, in my opinion, is probably the single most useful plugin I've ever installed for animation. Download the version right for your machine and let's get back into After Effects. Now, Animation Composer is found in a weird place. Go to Window, and you'll see it hiding out right here. From here, you can see all the free animation effects ready for you. The one we're looking for right now is under 2D layer transformations, scale, from anchor point proportionally. And the effect is overshoot scale from anchor point. Drag this into the transition slot. I run a preview and it shoots from a weird angle. A quick investigation reveals why. The anchor point has not been relocated yet. This transition works by manipulating the scale and position of the element relative to its anchor point. Let's press Y and move the anchor point to the center of the element. Now when we preview it, it looks like it's jumping at you from the page and instead of from across from it. If you look under the effect controls, you'll see that these animations come with some editable values. In this case, I want to reduce the number of bounces the element makes upon entry to 1 instead of 2. Now we'll do the same for the text. You can choose any animation you like, of course, but I went with 2D text animate words, position and scale, wiggly, wiggly position and scale words. Very catchy. Here, a great quick tip. With your mouse over any section of After Effects, press the tilde key to maximize that panel. Here I have a ton of space to work and visualize with. Press the tilde key again to return. Bring the Time Navigator slider in to focus on the area we're working on. The slider dictates the time the animation will take to complete. The shorter it is, the quicker the animation, and vice versa. I decide to let them be slightly staggered, with the text appearing a moment after its respective box. You'll notice that there are copy and paste buttons in Animation Composer, and I suggest you use them. Stagger the thought bubbles as well, so it appears to be climbing out of his head. The most accessible way to stagger items like this is to use the page down or page up buttons to move through the timeline frame by frame, and then using the square open bracket to move an asset to the start of the playhead. And we'll continue this way, adding animations to our text and boxes and adjusting anchor points as necessary. A nifty tool is to select pairs or logical sections of things and color code them by clicking on the colored squares beside them. Here, I alternate red and yellow to help visualize the different text pairs and keep my work organized. For this text, I use a different animation. This one, position words together from end, has a really cool action that makes the concept of the glove being slipped on really come to life. And at this point, we've done all our preliminary animating of the elements. To continue, we'll start by pre-composing all these individual elements into their own compositions. To do this, we start by selecting the elements we wish to group together, in this case a piece of text with its respective box, and then selecting Layer, PreCompose, or use the shortcut Ctrl-Shift-C. Here you can give your pre-comp a name. I'm using text1 because it's the first chunk of text that will appear. And here you can see how it's been turned into its own composition. And if you double click it, you can actually move into its composition to edit it in isolation. Here we select all the thought bubbles and the text and use the shortcut Ctrl-Shift-C. And we'll just quickly pre-compose the rest of these. Now we're ready to add a new level of animation, camera work. Start by going to Layer, New, Camera. You can look around at the options, but the default settings are perfect for what we need. This dialog box is telling us that we do not have any 3D layers for the camera to display. We'll address this in a second. First, go back to Layer, New, and choose Null Object. What I'm about to show you is probably the most common method of controlling a camera in After Effects. With the camera selected, press P to bring up its position settings. Now click and drag this icon. It's called the pick whip, and connect it to the Null Object. Now the Null Object is essentially an empty box, and what we're doing is using its position as a guide to move the camera. Instead of moving our camera around, we'll tell it to look at what the Null Object is doing and control that instead through its position and rotation settings. Now you may remember the warning message about 3D layers, and the way we make a 2D layer a 3D layer is by checking this box over here. Now you can see when we drag the position of the Null Object across, it looks like we're moving our object, but this is actually the camera panning across the scene. We can press R to bring up rotation and view our scene from a completely different angle. And so now, with our elements in place and our camera set up, we're ready to start doing some timeline animating. Use the Null Objects and center our scene back to where it should be. And now, with the playhead at the start of the timeline, press the stopwatch icon to add our first keyframe. What we've just told After Effects is that at this specific point in time, i.e. the beginning, we want the Null Object, which is essentially the camera, to be at this position, thereby creating our establishing shot. What we do now is drag the playhead forward in time. The amount doesn't really matter, so give yourself some space. We'll fine-tune the timing of everything once we have our keyframes laid out. Now, with the playhead repositioned, let's start playing with the position of the Null Object again. You'll notice that as soon as we adjust any setting that's being recorded by the stopwatch, it creates a new keyframe for us. Start by dragging the Z slider in. This is the back and forth motion from this perspective. We use this to zoom into the first frame. Once you're in close enough, you can start repositioning with X and Y. Fine-tune all these settings until you're sitting on a comfortable crop. I disabled the text elements for now to remove distractions. Our first camera transition looks good. Bring the keyframe in a little, and with it still selected, copy it by pressing Ctrl C. Then move the playhead forward a little and paste with Ctrl V. What we've done here is created a rift in time where the position of the camera will be static. This is when we want the camera to be still so that people can read our text elements. Move further along in time and start adjusting the Null Object's position again. Let's move it down to the second panel. Once we're happy with the position, move it forward an arbitrary amount and then paste. I want to add extra dimension to this panel, a slight rotation to make the motion more exciting. With the Null Object selected, press Shift R. This adds the rotation setting to your active panel. Move the playhead to the start of the transition towards this panel and select the stopwatch icon to add a keyframe. What we've told After Effects is at the start of this transition, we want rotation to be 0 on every axis. Now let's move to the end of the transition, i.e. when the panel is completely settled in the frame. And now adjust the rotation to a good closing angle. Scrubbing through the timeline, we can also get a really good sense for the flow of everything. Let's continue. Copy closing keyframes, and note here I copy both the position and rotation keyframes. Move forward and paste. Move forward, start editing, and so on. Remember that the distances between the keyframes don't matter right now. We'll be timing it to the length of our comp and the pacing of the audio later. For now, it's just about getting the animation itself laid out. You may have noticed that I haven't copied the rotation keyframe for a while. And the reason is because I'm no longer adjusting the rotation. The value of the final rotation keyframe is not going to change again. Spend some time fine-tuning the positions of all your transitions. Camera angles and transitions are about 60% of the charm of this animation, so spending time making it look as close to perfect is well worth the effort. So now that we have all the animation parts defined for our camera, we can start working on the timing. You can drag what are called composition markers from the side here and use them as guidelines. I space them out at 2-second intervals to give me an indication of when I want the transitions to be. Remember that these are just guides though, to get the bulk of our pacing done quickly. In animating, you almost always time your work according to the voiceover or music, so get the rough work out the way now and then fine-tune later. Select everything from the end back to where you need the next part to start. Move everything along to the marker. Leave a small gap for the static period and then plant the next markers further down. I keep using RAM preview by pressing 0 on the numpad. This plays the audio along with the animation, which allows me to judge where to position the keyframe. If you're wondering how I adjust all the keyframes at once, I hold Alt while dragging them. So here you can see we're pretty much done. We have the nice opening, the first few storytelling panels, the quick action shots, and then we come to rest on our closing panel. Looking good. Now I know we're super proud of ourselves for how we chose our composition duration, but what this animation lacks is a second of lead time. We put so much work into our opening panel and the camera doesn't linger on it at all. No good. Press Ctrl K to bring up the composition settings. Add a couple seconds and press OK. Shift the audio track forward a little and move all the null keyframes forward to hold the opening shot for just a moment. Now move the playhead to the end of the audio track. Lengthen the camera and null by dragging their ends and trim the comp like we did earlier. Also make sure the background has been extended. From here, it's just refining. Continue tweaking camera movements, anchor points, timing, and anything else I pick up on as I render and re-render the project, listening to the audio and pacing according to my best judgment. And now we're ready to create what I believe is our very last element, the question mark pop-ups. Go to the type tool and let's put down a question mark. Go to the character panel and let's bring up the size. Make the layer 3D and position it so that it's visible on screen. Adjust the anchor point and scale it to size. Now give it an interesting color and add a stroke. Lastly, make sure it's a font you like. And then once you're ready, add an intro animation from Animation Composer. And now we're ready to make duplicates of it. Let's randomize them around the screen and then rescale and rotate most or all of them to make each one unique. Select all the question marks and pre-comp them all together. Now drag the comp below the top layers and stagger it appropriately in the timeline. You'll notice here that all the question marks animate together. No problem. We'll just go into its composition and stagger the elements here. I move the playhead to the end of the static period and move back into the question mark comp to dictate the position of the final animation and then work backwards from there. The next step is to add a bit more drama to the camera movement. We'll start with a simple bit of animation code called Wiggle, which will add a wonderful organic shake to the camera. Select the Null Object and press the shortcut U to bring up its edited properties. Oops, sloppy positioning on the opening. Just fix that quickly. Okay, back on track. To add Wiggle, start by Alt-clicking the Properties button. You'll see the script editor open up. Wiggle is an easy command to learn. Type in Wiggle, open bracket, frequency, comma, amount, close bracket, and then click outside the area. You can edit the two values you've entered to change the feel and effect of the command. More or less movement, more or less often, will give different results. Choose the one you like best. And now we can see the camera adds this nice little shake to the shot to make it seem more real. Here I shy away everything but the camera and null objects to focus a little. Select the null and press U to bring up its keyframes. This button takes us to the graph editor. The graph editor provides a visual representation of the variables of keyframes. We use it to create what are called curves between keyframes to either ramp up, ramp down, or level the acceleration or deceleration of a change in a variable. Plainly stated, it allows you to give objects more natural movement. This tutorial won't be an in-depth dive into curves, but the basic points to remember are you want to easy ease between two keyframes, easy ease into the last keyframe or easy ease out of the first keyframe. It makes movements more gradual, providing an illusory sense of inertia. I select the last keyframe of the first transition and easy ease in and then preview several times. I do this for the other closing keyframes as well. Notice the change in the keyframe marker. Here, as a subtle enhancement, I choose to fade in the question marks with keyframe changes to their opacity, shortcut letter T. And now to bring in the logo for final placement. I had to go into the PSD and disable the background for this. Use Animation Composer and time it with the camera movement. And with that, we are ready to move on to render, which I think is a topic for another video entirely. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this tutorial useful and go on to make your own kick-ass animations in the future. And if you do, I'd love to see your work. Thanks so much for your time, but for now, until next time, Merry Christmas, and I'll see you guys later.